The crew of the USS Baton Rouge is hunting a ghost that the rest of the world believes is already dead. It is February 1992, and while politicians in Washington are celebrating the end of the Cold War, these men are running silent and deep beneath the freezing waters of the Arctic Circle. They do not yet know that the peace above the surface has made the darkness below it more dangerous than ever before. To understand why two nuclear-powered leviathans are about to collide in the dark, we must first understand the unique and perilous atmosphere of early 1992. On land, the history books are being closed with a satisfied thump. The Soviet Union has formally ceased to exist just 6 weeks earlier, taking its final breath on Christmas Day, 1991. The hammer and sickle has been lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The Berlin Wall is gone, reduced to souvenir fragments sold to tourists. The world is drunk on the idea of peace. In the corridors of power in Washington, London, and Paris, there is a prevailing belief that the great existential threat of the 20th century has evaporated. They call it the end of history. The American public believes the Russian bear is buried under the rubble of its own collapsed economy. But underwater, the war has not stopped. It hasn't even blinked. Navies do not operate on speeches, and they do not operate on optimism. They operate on standing orders, pre-approved mission profiles, and the heavy inertia of doctrine. The ocean is a place where political changes on the surface take a long time to filter down to the captains in command. When a submarine leaves port, it enters a sealed world of physics and acoustics, where the only reality is the pressure hull and the sonar screen. The crews of the United States Submarine Force did not receive a memo telling them to stand down. They did not receive orders to stop watching the gates of the Russian North. In fact, the situation is exactly the opposite. Historians like Anne Applebaum and others who study the collapse of totalitarian systems note that the most dangerous moment for an empire is not when it is strong, but when it is crumbling. In 1992, the Soviet Union has fragmented into 15 separate republics. The command structures are confused. The funding has dried up. Food is scarce in the naval towns of the Kola Peninsula. This creates a terrifying strategic paradox. The war is officially over, but the weapons are still there. The nuclear missiles are still in their silos. The submarines are still tied to the piers. And no one in NATO knows who exactly has their finger on the trigger. This uncertainty transforms the mission of the USS Baton Rouge. She is not there to fight a war. She is there to determine if the enemy is still capable of fighting one. Washington needs to know if the Russian Navy is dissolving or if it is merely sleeping. They need to know if the captains are still maintaining discipline or if they have gone rogue. The only way to find out is to go there and look. This brings us to the secret lineage of operations, known for decades as Holy Stone, and later renamed Barnacle. For the better part of 40 years, American attack submarines have been playing a lethal game of cat and mouse inside the oceanic backyard of the Soviet Union. These are not standard patrols in the open Atlantic. These are intelligence-gathering penetrations that take American vessels dangerously close to the enemy coastline. According to disclosures that would only emerge years later, these submarines were sometimes ordered to penetrate Soviet territorial waters, getting as close as 3 miles from the beach to steal secrets. The mission profile for a Barnacle operation is technically audacious. It relies on the arrogance of American engineering and the skill of American crews. The objectives are varied, but they are all incredibly risky. One of the primary goals is the voice print. Every submarine, like every human being, has a unique signature. A loose valve, a noisy coolant pump, a slightly unbalanced propeller shaft. These mechanical imperfections create a specific acoustic frequency. If an American submarine can get close enough to record that sound, the Navy can feed the data into the massive SOSUS listening network. Once the voice print is cataloged, that specific Russian boat can be tracked anywhere in the world's oceans. It can never hide again. But to get that recording, you have to be close. You have to be uncomfortably close. Another objective involves the hull check. In these maneuvers, U.S. submarines would sneak up underneath a Soviet vessel to photograph its propellers and analyze its hull coatings. We are talking about 6,000-ton steel cylinders maneuvering within 50 feet of each other in pitch-black water. They are moving blind, relying only on the passive listening of their sonar teams to build a mental picture of the target. It is a feat of seamanship that borders on the impossible. Then there is the legendary cable tap, a mission made famous by Operation Ivy Bells. American submarines would sit on the ocean floor, deploy divers, and install recording pods on the underwater communication cables connecting Soviet naval bases. These cables carried the unencrypted conversations of the Soviet High Command, who believed that the ocean floor was a secure sanctuary. They were wrong. The USS Baton Rouge, commanded by Commander Gordon Kremer, is the inheritor of this aggressive tradition. She is a Los Angeles-class hunter-killer, the backbone of the American fleet. She is fast, quiet, and designed to dominate the deep ocean. But on this mission, she is not hunting in the open sea. She is lurking just outside the entrance to the main Russian naval base at Severomorsk. She is the gatekeeper. She is waiting for a target to come out to play. The geography of this mission is critical to understanding the disaster that is about to unfold. The Barents Sea is not the deep, welcoming blue of the Pacific. It is a shallow, hostile, rocky shelf. The water is cold, dense, and full of noise. The coast of the Kola Peninsula is a jagged line of fjords and inlets that hide the most sensitive military installations in Russia. This is the home of the Northern Fleet. It is the bastion where the Soviet Union kept its ballistic missile submarines, the weapons that guaranteed their nuclear deterrent. By sitting off Kildin Island, the Baton Rouge is sitting on the doorstep of the Russian Strategic Reserve. In February 1992, the atmosphere inside the American boat is a mix of high professionalism and intense caution. The crew knows that the political situation is fragile. They know that if they are caught, it won't just be a diplomatic incident. It could derail the delicate peace. Negotiations happening in capitals around the world. Secretary of State James Baker is scheduled to meet with Russian President Boris Yeltsin in just a few days. The agenda is peace, disarmament, and food aid. The last thing any diplomat wants is a naval collision in the Arctic. But the intelligence community has different priorities. They operate on the logic of worst-case scenarios. They need to know if the Russian Northern Fleet is still operational. There are rumors that the Russian Navy is rusting at the pier, that the sailors are unpaid and mutinous. There are other reports that the most modern Russian submarines are still prowling, testing their capabilities and maintaining their readiness for a war that everyone else thinks is over. This disconnect creates a dangerous psychological environment. The American crew is trained to treat the Soviet Navy as a lethal adversary. They have spent their entire careers studying the silhouettes of Russian ships, memorizing their sonar frequencies, and drilling for combat. You cannot simply turn off that mindset like a light switch. When the sonar operators on the Baton Rouge stare at their waterfalls of green data, they are not looking for friends. They are looking for the enemy. The concept of territorial waters adds another layer of tension. The United States and the Soviet Union, and now the Russian Federation, have long disagreed on where the line in the water actually sits. The Russians use a straight baseline method to draw their borders, connecting the outer points of islands and capes to create a perimeter that extends far out to sea. The United States insists on a strict 12-mile limit following the curvature of the coast. This creates a gray zone, a slice of ocean that Russia claims as its own sovereign territory, but that the United States regards as international waters. It is in this gray zone that the game is played. American submarines enter these contested waters to assert freedom of navigation and to gather intelligence. The Russians regard this as a violation of their national sovereignty. For decades, this dispute has been managed with intense professionalism. Russian destroyers might charge at American ships to scare them off, or planes might buzz the decks, but actual collisions are rare. However, the winter of 1992 is different. The Russian defensive posture is brittle. A wounded animal is unpredictable, and the Russian military is deeply wounded. Their pride has been shattered by the collapse of their empire. They are watching their country fall apart on television. The officers of the Northern Fleet are the last guardians of Soviet power. They are watching the horizon with a mix of paranoia and resentment. They know the Americans are out there. They know the victors of the Cold War are circling, watching, and measuring. And they are right. The USS Baton Rouge is performing a mission that is essentially an autopsy on a living subject. The goal is to verify the decline of Russian power. But in doing so, they are about to discover that the reports of the Russian Navy's death have been exaggerated. The specific target they are waiting for is not a rusting hulk or a relic of the past. It is a masterpiece of material science. While the American submarine waits in the acoustic shadows, a shape begins to move in the harbor of Severomorsk. It is the K-276 Kostroma. To the NATO analysts who categorize these things, it is known as a Sierra-class interceptor. It is one of the most expensive, complex, and formidable underwater fighting machines ever built. It is not made of the steel that lines the hull of the Baton Rouge. It is forged from a material that the West deemed too expensive and too difficult to work with for mass production. The collision course is being set not just by geography, but by two diverging philosophies of warfare. One side believes in mass production, efficiency, and the good enough solution that won the war of attrition. The other side believes in absolute survivability, exotic materials, and the creation of a titanium fortress that can withstand the crushing pressures of the deep. The Baton Rouge represents the industrial might of the United States, the strategy of building many good ships to overwhelm the enemy. The Kostroma represents the obsession of the Soviet Union, the strategy of building a few invincible ships to terrify the enemy. As the Baton Rouge patrols her sector, the data streams into the control room. The ocean temperature is freezing, hovering just near the point where seawater turns to ice. The salinity levels affect the buoyancy. The thermal layers in the water create mirrors and blind spots for the sonar. It is a difficult environment for any sensor suite. The crew is relying on their training and their technology to keep them safe. They trust their ship. They trust the steel that surrounds them. But trust is a fragile thing in the Barents Sea. The crew of the Baton Rouge is operating under the assumption that they are the hunters, the invisible observers of a fallen regime. They do not realize that the physics of the ocean can turn a hunter into prey in a matter of seconds. They are about to learn that the end of history is a political concept, not a physical one. In the water, the laws of motion and mass still apply. And when 18,000 tons of displacement meet in a confined space, the result is never determined by who won the Cold War. It is determined by which metal is harder. The collision that is about to happen is not just a traffic accident. It is a violent engineering debate. When the metal screams and the hulls buckle, it will be the final test of two competing visions of naval warfare. On one side is the American philosophy, pragmatic, efficient, and built for mass production. On the other is the Soviet philosophy, paranoid, expensive, and obsessed with invulnerability. To understand why the Baton Rouge will break and the Kostroma will bounce, we have to look beneath the paint. We have to look at the atoms. The USS Baton Rouge is a Los Angeles-class attack submarine, hull number 689. To the American Navy, this class is the 688, the workhorse of the fleet. It is the Ford F-150 of the underwater world, reliable, fast, and built in large numbers. 62 of these boats were constructed, swarming the oceans to track Soviet ballistic missile submarines and protect American carrier battle groups. The design philosophy of the 688 class is defined by the Cold War reality of the United States. We need a lot of them, and we need them quickly. The hull of the Baton Rouge is constructed from HY80 steel. The HY stands for high yield, and the 80 represents its yield strength of 80,000 pounds per square inch. This alloy is a masterpiece of mid-century metallurgy. It contains specific amounts of nickel, chromium, and molybdenum. It is incredibly tough, capable of flexing under the immense pressure of the deep ocean without cracking. But its greatest advantage is logistical. It is weldable in open air. American shipyards like Newport News and Electric Boat could churn out these submarines on assembly lines. They could cut the steel plates, bend them into cylinders, and weld them together with relative speed. However, this efficiency comes with a trade-off. The Los Angeles class utilizes a single-hull architecture. Imagine a soda can. The metal skin on the outside is the same barrier that holds back the ocean pressure. Inside this pressure hull, there are steel ribs, or transverse frames, that keep the circle from collapsing. But there is no outer armor. There is no second skin. If something hits the side of a Los Angeles-class sub, it impacts the pressure vessel almost directly. The only thing between the crew and the crushing weight of the sea is that single layer of HY80 steel. This design is a calculated risk. By eliminating the outer hull, American designers saved weight and reduced drag. This gave the 688 class its legendary speed, officially greater than 25 knots, but in reality much faster. It created more internal volume for weapons, electronics, and the crew. The philosophy was simple. The best defense is not to get hit. Use your superior sonar to see the enemy first. Use your speed to outrun a torpedo. Survivability was based on avoidance, not endurance. But the Soviet engineers at the Rubin Design Bureau in Leningrad saw the world differently. They were not building F-150s. They were building tanks. Meet the enemy, the K-276 Kostroma. NATO designates this the Sierra class. If the Baton Rouge is a triumph of mass production, the Kostroma is a triumph of brute force material science. The Soviets knew they could not match American electronics or sonar processing power in the 1970s and 80s, so they decided to change the rules of the game. They decided that if they couldn't see the Americans first, they would build a ship that the Americans couldn't kill. The pressure hull of the Kostroma is not made of steel. It is forged from titanium alloy. Using titanium for a submarine hull is an engineer's dream and a bean counter's nightmare. Titanium is 40% lighter than steel, but just as strong. It is non-magnetic, which makes the submarine harder to detect with magnetic anomaly detectors used by patrol aircraft. Most importantly, it is highly resistant to corrosion. A titanium hull doesn't rust, it endures. This high strength-to-weight ratio allowed Soviet designers to build a pressure hull that could dive significantly deeper than their American counterparts, reportedly over 2,000 feet, depths that would crush a steel boat like an empty can. But working with titanium is excruciatingly difficult. You cannot weld it in open air. If hot titanium touches oxygen, it becomes brittle and cracks. To build the Kostroma, the Soviets had to construct massive hermetically sealed warehouses at the Sevmash shipyard. Workers wore spacesuit-like protective gear. The entire building was flooded with argon gas to create an inert atmosphere for welding. The cost was astronomical. The Soviet Union bankrupted itself building these machines. They only managed to build 4 Sierra-class submarines. But the titanium was just the skeleton. The armor was the double-hull design. The Kostroma is essentially a ship inside a ship. The inner pressure hull, where the crew lives and the reactor sits, is wrapped inside a second outer hull made of lighter titanium plating. Between these two hulls is a gap of 1 to 2 meters. This space is flooded with water and packed with equipment like ballast tanks and sonar arrays. In a collision, this gap acts as a massive hydraulic shock absorber. It is a crumple zone. If a torpedo or another submarine hits the outer skin, the energy is dissipated through the water and the structure before it ever reaches the inner pressure hull. The Soviet philosophy was explicit. If contact occurs, the ship must survive. They assumed they would be hit. They assumed they would be fighting outnumbered. So they built a fortress. The differences extend to the sail, the conning tower that rises from the deck. On the Baton Rouge, the sail is a housing for periscopes and antennas. It is made of steel and fiberglass. It is streamlined for speed, but structurally, it is relatively light. On the Kostroma, the sail is a weapon. The Sierra class was designed for operations under the Arctic ice cap. In an emergency, it needed to be able to surface through several feet of solid ice to launch its missiles or communicate. The sail is reinforced with heavy titanium framing. The leading edge is blunt and hardened. It is effectively a giant titanium axe blade designed to punch through a frozen ceiling. So, the stage is set for a collision that is physically unfair from the start. In the red corner, we have a double-hulled titanium armored tank designed to smash through ice. In the blue corner, we have a single-hulled, steel-skinned Ferrari designed to run fast and never get touched. These two design philosophies reflect the nations that built them. The United States, confident in its technological superiority and logistical depth, prioritized offense and efficiency. The Soviet Union, deeply scarred by the invasion of World War II and paranoid about encirclement, prioritized defense and survivability. The Americans built a fleet to control the sea lanes. The Soviets built a fleet to survive a nuclear apocalypse. The tragedy is that neither ship was designed to fight the other in a wrestling match. Submarines are designed to fight with torpedoes at a distance of 10 miles. They are snipers, not boxers. A collision is the one scenario that renders all the electronics, all the missiles, and all the training irrelevant. It reduces the conflict to simple Newtonian physics: mass times acceleration, hardness versus yield strength. As the Baton Rouge and the Kostroma maneuver in the dark near Kildin Island, they represent the apex of Cold War engineering. They are the two deadliest machines ever placed in the ocean, but they are operating blind. The pilots, Commander Kramer and Captain Locott, are relying on acoustic pictures that are fuzzy and delayed. They are like men walking through a dark room with flashlights that only flicker on every few seconds. The collision is inevitable because both sides are operating under assumptions that are valid only in isolation. The American captain assumes his passive sonar will hear any Russian boat before it gets too close. The Russian captain assumes that if he checks his baffles and hears nothing, the water is clear. Neither of them accounts for the specific environmental trap of the Barents Sea, which is about to hide an 18,000-ton monster in plain sight. This is where the story shifts from engineering to physics. The best steel in the world and the finest titanium in Russia are about to be tested against each other. And while the politicians in Washington and Moscow are shaking hands and talking about a new era of cooperation, the laws of mechanics are preparing to deliver a verdict that no treaty can overturn. When steel meets titanium at 8:16 p.m., there will be no negotiation. There will only be the yield point. The American steel is designed to bend. The Russian titanium is designed to break things. And right now, they are on a convergent vector that is closing at a combined speed of barely 10 knots, slow enough to feel every screeching second of the impact, but fast enough to ruin $1 billion worth of hardware. The Baton Rouge is about to learn a harsh lesson about structural vulnerability. The single-hull design, so perfect for the open ocean and the budget sheets of Congress, has an Achilles heel. It cannot take a punch. It relies on the perfect circularity of its frame to resist the pressure of the deep. If you dent that circle, if you deform the ribs even by a fraction of an inch, the mathematics of the hull collapse. The ocean is always waiting for a weakness, and the Kostroma is about to provide one. This is the hidden layer of the conflict. It isn't just America versus Russia. It is the philosophy of don't get hit versus the philosophy of I can take the hit. On February 11th, 1992, the philosophy of avoidance is going to fail, and the philosophy of endurance is going to be the only thing that matters. The Barents Sea is a liar. To the eye, it is a vast gray expanse of freezing water, capped by white foam and winter storms. But to the ear, the only sense that matters underwater, it is a hall of mirrors. It is an acoustic nightmare designed to confuse, hide, and deceive. On the evening of February 11th, 1992, the USS Baton Rouge and the K-276 Kostroma are not just fighting each other, they are fighting the environment. Why couldn't two of the most advanced sensor platforms on the planet see each other? Both ships are equipped with multi-million-dollar sonar suites. They have hydrophones towed behind them on long cables. They have spherical arrays in their noses that can theoretically hear a whale singing from 50 miles away. They should have heard a pin drop, but they didn't, and the reason lies in the treacherous physics of shallow water acoustics. Deep water is honest. In the middle of the Atlantic, where the bottom is 3 miles down, sound travels in clean, predictable lines. It bends slightly with temperature, but the math is reliable. If you hear a noise, you know where it is coming from. But the water off Kildin Island is shallow, barely 200 to 300 feet deep in the patrol sectors. This changes everything. When a propeller churns or a pump whines in shallow water, the sound waves don't just travel straight to the listener. They hit the surface and bounce back down. They hit the rocky seabed and bounce back up. They reflect off the thermal layers where cold water meets slightly warmer currents. This creates a chaotic phenomenon called multipath interference. The sonar operators aren't hearing one clear signal. They are hearing 1,000 echoes of the same signal, arriving at slightly different times. It sounds like a garbled mess. It is the audio equivalent of trying to spot a sniper in a room full of disco balls. To make matters worse, there is a storm raging on the surface. The wind is whipping the Barents Sea into a frenzy. Every breaking wave, every crashing whitecap sends a burst of noise down into the water column. In sonar terms, this is called ambient noise. On February 11, the ambient noise is deafening. It acts like a thick blanket of static, masking the subtle mechanical sounds of the submarines. The Baton Rouge and the Kostroma are effectively hiding in a blizzard of white noise. But the blindness is not just environmental. It is geometric. Submarine warfare is a game of angles. Every submarine has a fatal flaw built into its design: the baffles. Because the propeller is located at the very back of the ship, it churns the water and creates a cone of cavitation noise. The sonar array in the nose cannot look backward through its own ship. The hydrophones on the side are deafened by the prop wash. Directly behind every submarine is a 60-degree cone of total blindness. If an enemy ship sits in your baffles, you cannot hear him. He doesn't exist. Standard operating procedure to clear this blind spot is a maneuver called clearing the baffles. The submarine turns sharply to the left or right, allowing its side-scan sonar to peek into the dead zone behind it. Captains do this religiously, especially before changing depth or surfacing. Captain Igor Lokot on the Kostroma is a professional. He knows the rules. At approximately 8:16 p.m., he prepares to bring his ship up from the deep. He is likely running at a depth of roughly 20 to 30 meters, preparing for a communications check or a navigation fix. Before he orders the ascent, he checks his sonar. Nothing. He orders a turn to clear his baffles. His operators listen intently. Silence. The green waterfall displays on the Russian consoles show nothing but the static of the storm and the clutter of the rocky bottom. There is no rhythmic thumping of an American propeller. There is no 60 hertz hum of an American reactor coolant pump. Captain Locotte believes he is alone. Why didn't he hear the Baton Rouge? Because the American submarine isn't just behind him, she is above him. This is the fatal geometry of the collision. Reconstructions suggest that Commander Kramer on the Baton Rouge is keeping his boat at periscope depth, roughly 60 feet below the surface. He is likely hovering there, listening, perhaps trying to get a satellite fix or eavesdrop on surface communications. The Baton Rouge is moving slowly, barely making a whisper. In the noisy, shallow water, her acoustic signature is blending perfectly into the surface storm noise. To the Russian sonar below, the American sub sounds just like another wave crashing overhead. The Kostroma is deep. The Baton Rouge is shallow. This vertical separation is the killer. Sonar is generally good at detecting bearing, left or right, but it is notoriously bad at detecting elevation, up or down. The Russian sensors are looking out into the gloom, scanning the horizon. They are not looking up at the ceiling. At 8:16 p.m., Captain Locotte gives the order. Surface. The plainsmen on the Kostroma pull back on the yokes. The bow of the titanium giant angles upward. The ballast tanks are trimmed for buoyancy. The 9,000-ton vessel begins to rise. It is not moving forward very fast, perhaps only 6 or 7 knots, but its vertical velocity is increasing. It is rising like a balloon released from the bottom of a pool. Above them, the Baton Rouge is blind too. Her sonar is optimized to listen down, into the deep water where threats usually live. She is also struggling with the baffles issue. The Kostroma is likely approaching from below and slightly behind, in the acoustic shadow of the American boat's own hull. The American sonar operators are straining to hear through the storm, but the physics are working against them. The sound waves from the Kostroma are being deflected by the thermal layers, or masked by the surface noise. It is the perfect ambush, but it is an accidental one. Neither captain wants this. Neither crew is looking for a fight. They are just 2 blind men in a dark room, and one of them has decided to stand up at the exact moment the other is leaning over. The Baton Rouge is the ceiling, the Kostroma is the floor, and the floor is coming up fast. There is a terrifying intimacy to this moment. In modern naval combat, death usually arrives from miles away. A missile or a torpedo that gives you minutes of warning. But this is different. This is proximity. The 2 crews, separated by nationality, ideology, and language, are physically only a few dozen meters apart. They are breathing the same recycled air, drinking the same coffee, worrying about the same families back home. They are watching the same clock tick toward 8:16 p.m. The ocean has set a trap for them. It has stripped away their technological advantages. It has rendered their billion-dollar ears deaf. It has turned the most sophisticated game of chess on Earth into a game of blind man's bluff. On the Kostroma, the depth gauge unwinds. 30 meters, 25 meters, 22 meters. The ship is rising smoothly. The crew feels the slight upward tilt of the deck. It is a routine maneuver. They have done it 100 times. There is no alarm, no flashing red light, just the quiet hum of the ship and the routine commands of the watch officer. On the Baton Rouge, the routine is equally mundane. The ship is holding its depth. The officer of the deck is monitoring the station keeping. The sonar room is quiet. the operators entranced by the glowing screens, their headphones pressing against their ears, searching for a pattern in the chaos. They are looking for a Russian sub that they believe is miles away, or perhaps still in port. They do not realize that the monster is right beneath their keel. The seconds tick away, the distance closes. 10 meters, 5 meters. It is a failure of imagination as much as technology. Neither side truly expects the other to be right there. The ocean is huge. The odds of two ships occupying the exact same coordinate in the vastness of the Barents Sea are astronomically low. It is a statistical impossibility. But war, even a cold one, has a way of defying statistics. It forces assets into choke points. It concentrates danger. The entrance to Severomorsk is a funnel, and both ships have been drawn into the neck of it. The silence in the control rooms is about to be shattered. The illusion of mastery over the environment is about to be broken. The Barents Sea has successfully hidden the two adversaries from each other until it is too late to do anything but brace for impact. Physics takes over now. There is no time for a rudder command. No time for an emergency blow. The inertia of 9,000 tons of rising titanium cannot be stopped in a split second. The Kostroma is a hammer swinging upward. The Baton Rouge is the anvil waiting in the dark. And at 8:16 p.m., the trap snaps shut. At 8:16 p.m., the K-276 Kostroma breaks the laws of routine navigation. It is rising with the relentless momentum of 9,000 tons of displacement. Above it, the USS Baton Rouge is a horizontal steel barrier, suspended 60 feet below the surface. The geometry is finally resolved in a single, catastrophic instant. The impact is an uppercut. The reinforced titanium sail of the Kostroma, that blunt, hardened axe blade designed to punch through polar ice, slams into the bottom of the Baton Rouge on the port side, just aft of the American sail. It is not a glancing blow. It is not a scrape. It is a violent vertical interception. The physics of the collision are defined by the difference in stiffness between the two materials. The Kostroma's sail is a rigid titanium structure. It hits the Baton Rouge's HY-80 steel hull plates. In that fraction of a second, the titanium refuses to yield. It deforms elastically, absorbing the energy and preparing to spring back. The American steel, however, has nowhere to go. It yields plastically. The metal screams as it is forced inward, transferring the massive kinetic energy of the rising Russian submarine directly into the frame of the American boat. The result is terrifying. The Kostroma acts like a hydraulic jack firing upward. It violently displaces the Baton Rouge, lifting the 6,000-ton American vessel bodily through the water column. For a heartbeat, the two nuclear-powered leviathans are locked together in a grotesque metallic embrace, a tangle of titanium and steel grinding against each other in the dark. Then, gravity reasserts itself. The Baton Rouge rolls violently to starboard, shedding the impact. The Kostroma, having expended its upward momentum against the steel ceiling, bounces off and plunges back down into the depths. Inside the Baton Rouge, the world ends. The crew does not hear a bump. They feel an earthquake. One moment they are standing on a level deck, monitoring a silent ocean. The next, the deck is heaving beneath them. In the galley, dishes shatter and trays go flying. In the control room, men grab stanchions, consoles, anything bolted down to keep from being thrown across the space. Commander Creamer clutches the periscope stand, his eyes wide. But it is the sound that freezes the blood. It is a screaming, tearing screech, the sound of metal being flayed alive. It is the sound of a giant rasp being dragged across the skin of the ship. It lasts for several agonizing seconds, a noise so loud it drowns out orders and alarms. Panic sets in instantly, but it is a disciplined panic. Collision. Collision! Port side! The first thought in every sailor's mind is not Russian submarine. That is too absurd. The first thought is iceberg or bottom. They think they have hit an underwater mountain. But then the realization hits. They are in deep water. There is no ice here. As the ship stabilizes, rolling back from the list, the sonar operators hear something that turns their fear into dread. Through their headphones, cutting through the ringing in their ears, they hear the distinct rising whine of a foreign turbine. They hear the high-speed cavitation of twin propellers digging into the water. Con, sonar, hydroacoustic contact, close aboard. Commander Kramer realizes the truth instantly. They haven't hit a rock. They have been hit by a hunter. The fear of a hull breach is immediate and overwhelming. If the HY-80 steel has cracked, if the pressure hull has been pierced, the Atlantic Ocean will rush in at hundreds of pounds per square inch. It will cut men in half. It will sink the ship in minutes. Emergency surface! Blow all main ballast! The order is screamed. The chief of the watch hits the chicken switches. High-pressure air blasts into the ballast tanks with a roar, forcing the water out. The Baton Rouge angles up, shooting toward the surface like a panicked whale, her crew praying that the steel holds. On the Kostroma, the experience is different. They are the hammer. Captain Locott feels the ship shudder violently and stop dead in its ascent. It is as if they have hit a concrete ceiling. The impact throws men off their feet. The lights flicker. The hull groans under the stress. Locott's first thought matches the Americans. We hit the ice. He checks the depth gauge. It reads roughly 20 meters. Too deep for ice in this sector. The Barents Sea shouldn't have a ceiling here. Then his sonar operator screams. Hydroacoustic contact, bearing 090, high-speed screw noise. Locott realizes he has just headbutted an intruder. The adrenaline surges. This is the Soviet nightmare scenario. A collision near the base. Is it an attack? Did the Americans ram him on purpose? Is this the opening move of a war? Battle stations. Torpedo room, stand by. The Russian crew scrambles. The alarms blare, a harsh, rhythmic klaxon that signals imminent danger. The Kostroma is a wounded beast now, circling in the dark. Locott orders the ship to surface immediately. He needs to see what he hit. He needs to see if he is sinking. The Kostroma breaks the surface, foam cascading off her battered sail. Locott rushes to the bridge, climbing the ladder through the conning tower. He throws open the hatch and is blasted by the freezing wind and the spray of the storm. He raises his binoculars. Through the winter gloom, lit only by the faint gray light of the Arctic night and the whitecaps of the waves, he sees it. A massive black shape is wallowing in the swells a few hundred yards away. It is long, sleek, and unmistakably American. It is the Baton Rouge. She is listing slightly. She looks wounded. Locott stares at the enemy. He sees the steam rising from her vents. He sees the distinct silhouette of a Los Angeles-class sub. The audacity of it hits him. They were right here. They were sitting on top of us. The Kostroma circles. Her own damage is ugly to look at. The front of the titanium sail is smashed in. The sonar fairing on the leading edge is gone, crushed like a tin can. But Locott checks the damage reports coming from below. Pressure hull? Intact, Captain. No leaks. No radiation. The double hull construction has done its job. The outer casing took the hit. The water gap absorbed the shock. The inner titanium sphere, the heart of the ship, is untouched. The Kostroma is bruised, but she is alive. She is fighting fit. On the Baton Rouge, the reports are less certain. The ship is on the surface, bobbing in the rough seas. The crew is rushing through the compartments, checking for leaks. Engine room, dry. Torpedo room, dry. They are alive. The hull didn't crack open. But the damage is structural. The impact has compressed the frame of the ship. The steel ribs have been bent. The Baton Rouge is no longer a perfect circle. She is an oval. The integrity of the pressure vessel has been compromised. She is floating, but she is crippled. And then there is the smoking gun. When the Kostroma returns to port later, Russian sailors will climb onto the battered sail to inspect the damage. Embedded in the jagged, torn titanium metal, they will find pieces of strange material. They will find chunks of black rubber and ceramic. It is fragments of the Baton Rouge's anechoic coating, the sound-absorbing tiles glued to the hull of American subs. The Kostroma literally scraped the skin off the American boat. It is physical, forensic proof that the Americans were right there, inside Russian waters, or at least right on the line. Back on the surface, the two captains stare at each other across the waves. It is a surreal moment. The Cold War is supposed to be over. They are supposed to be partners in a new world order. But here they are, battle stations manned, tubes flooded, staring down the barrels of their respective machines. Commander Kramer has a choice. He is damaged. He is exposed. He is in hostile waters. He orders the Baton Rouge to turn for home. They limp away, heading west, back toward the safety of the open Atlantic. They transmit a message to COM Sublant, Commander, Submarine Force Atlantic. Collision, submerged, Russian unit involved. The message travels at the speed of light to Norfolk, then to the Pentagon, then to the White House. It lands on desks like a bomb. The collision is over. The physics have done their work. Now, the politics begin. And in Washington, the panic is just starting. The morning after the collision, the USS Baton Rouge is limping toward Norfolk, Virginia, a wounded animal seeking the safety of its den. But while the submarine moves slowly through the Atlantic, the news of the incident travels instantly to the highest levels of power. In Washington, the reaction isn't just concern, it is panic. The timing could not be worse. Secretary of State James Baker is scheduled to meet with Russian President Boris Yeltsin in Moscow in just a few days. The agenda is critical. They are supposed to be discussing nuclear disarmament, the security of the Soviet arsenal, and massive food aid packages to keep Russia from starving. They are building the foundation of the post-Cold War world. And now, the U.S. Navy has to explain why they just rammed a Russian nuclear submarine right on the doorstep of Russia's most sensitive naval base. The Pentagon faces a dilemma. Standard operating procedure for submarine operations is strict. Neither confirm nor deny. Usually, if a sub hits something, the Navy stays silent. They might admit to hitting an unidentified object, but they never admit to spying. But this time, silence is not an option. The Russians are already shouting. In Moscow, the naval command is furious. They are parading the Kostroma in front of the cameras. They are showing the dented titanium sail on the evening news. They are holding up the fragments of American anechoic tile pulled from the wreckage like trophies. They are accusing the United States of hooliganism and cowboy tactics. Boris Yeltsin, facing immense pressure from his own hardliners who hate the West, accuses the U.S. of acting with arrogance. The Russian Navy demands an apology. They claim the Baton Rouge was 5 miles inside their territorial waters. The Pentagon realizes they have to get ahead of the story. In an unprecedented move, they break silence. They issue a press release admitting the collision, but they spin it. They claim the Baton Rouge was in international waters, more than 12 miles from the shore. They insist it was an accident. They downplay the damage. The official statement makes it sound like a fender bender. It describes minor cuts and scrapes. It assures the public that there was no radiation leak and no danger to the crew. But when the Baton Rouge finally arrives in Norfolk and enters the dry dock, the water is pumped out And the lie is exposed. The damage is not cosmetic. It is structural trauma. Engineers swarm over the hull. They strip away the damaged tiles. What they find underneath is terrifying to a naval architect. The impact of the 9,000-ton Kostroma didn't just dent the skin. It subjected the Baton Rouge to a massive lateral shock load. The Los Angeles-class design relies on the perfect geometry of its transverse frames, the steel ribs that hold the hull in a circle. The collision has caused plastic deformation in these frames. The hull is no longer perfectly round. It is slightly oval. To a layman, a deviation of a few millimeters seems irrelevant. To a submarine, it is a death sentence. A pressure hull works because the water pressure pushes equally on all sides, compressing the circle uniformly. If the circle is out of round, the pressure concentrates on the flat spots. It creates stress risers. If the Baton Rouge were to dive to her test depth now, the ocean would find those weak points and crush the hull like a paper cup. The engineers run the numbers. Can she be fixed? Technically, yes. But the repair would be a nightmare. They wouldn't just be patching a hole. They would have to cut out massive sections of the pressure hull. They would have to reframe the ship, realign the keel, and weld in new HY-80 steel plates. It is major surgery on a nuclear vessel. The bill would be hundreds of millions of dollars. And this is where the Baton Rouge runs into an enemy deadlier than the Kostroma: economics. It is 1992. The defense budget is in free fall. Congress is looking for the peace dividend. They are slashing spending on new weapons and retiring old ones. The Navy looks at the ledger. The Baton Rouge is 15 years old, halfway through her expected lifespan. She is also due for a nuclear refueling, a complex process that costs $200 to $300 million on its own. The math is brutal. Add the collision repair costs to the refueling costs, and the price tag is astronomical. It doesn't make sense to spend $500 million to fix a middle-aged submarine when the war is over. The Navy makes a cold, calculated decision. They declare the Baton Rouge a constructive total loss. It is a quiet, bureaucratic death. There is no ceremony. There is no final patrol. On November 1st, 1993, less than 2 years after the crash, the USS Baton Rouge is decommissioned. She becomes the very first Los Angeles-class submarine to be sent to the graveyard. She is towed to the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. Workers with plasma torches cut through the steel that failed her. They slice the ship into segments. The reactor compartment is removed and buried in a trench in Hanford, Washington. The rest is melted down into razor blades. The collision, combined with the brutal economics of the 1990s, has killed her. Meanwhile, in Russia, the story is very different. The Kostroma pulls into the Nurpa shipyard on the Kola Peninsula. The damage looks ugly. The sail is smashed. The sensors are gone. But the engineers check the pressure hull, the titanium heart of the ship. Zero damage. The double hull architecture functioned exactly as designed. The outer light hull and the water-filled gap absorbed the kinetic energy. The inner pressure hull remained perfectly circular. The structural integrity of the submarine is 100%. The repair is simple. They cut away the damaged sections of the sail and the outer skin. They weld on new titanium plates. It is bodywork, not surgery. Repairs begin on March 28, 1992. They are finished on June 29, 1992. 3 months. While the American boat is awaiting a death sentence, the Russian boat returns to operational service. The Kostroma didn't just survive, she thrived. The Russian crew knows exactly what happened. They hear the news that the Baton Rouge is being scrapped. In the naval tradition, if you sink an enemy ship, you paint a victory mark on your tower. The Kostroma hadn't fired a torpedo, but she had taken an enemy capital ship off the board just as effectively as if she had. So, the crew paints a kill mark on the freshly repaired sail. It is a red star with the number 1 inside it. The Russian sailors even have a joke about it. Their captain's name is Lokot, which means elbow in Russian. So they call the collision the elbow strike, a playful jab at how they nudged the Americans out of the way. It is an unofficial, cheeky, arrogant signal to the US Navy. It says, "We survived, you didn't." When the Kostroma goes back on patrol in the late 90s, NATO pilots fly over her and photograph the star. It becomes a legend in the intelligence community. The steel sub is gone. The titanium sub is wearing its trophy. This outcome validates the Soviet design philosophy in the harshest possible way. Titanium has superior survivability characteristics to steel in a collision scenario. In this specific head-to-head smash, the titanium double hull survived. The steel single hull died. So why doesn't the US Navy build titanium submarines today? Why are the modern Virginia-class and even the upcoming SSN-X still made of steel? Because of the principle of strategic mass. The Kostroma was a technological marvel, but she was an economic nightmare. The Soviets could only afford to build 4 of them. The United States, sticking with inferior HY-80 steel, built 62 Los Angeles-class submarines. The U.S. Navy accepted a lower individual hull strength in exchange for producibility. Steel allows for rapid welding. It allows for modular construction. In a war of attrition, 62 good-enough submarines will destroy 4 invincible submarines. The Baton Rouge was expendable. The Kostroma was a unicorn. The collision was a tactical victory for Russia. The Kostroma won the fight. But the fact that the U.S. could afford to scrap the Baton Rouge without blinking proved they had won the strategic war. The American system could absorb the loss. The Soviet system, which produced the Kostroma, had already collapsed under the weight of its own expense. But the collision leaves a scar on history that goes deeper than metal. It forces a change in behavior. Before February 1992, American subs were aggressive. They pushed into the 12-mile limit constantly. After the collision, while there was no formal treaty signed, the behavior changed. The diplomatic fallout between James Baker and Boris Yeltsin was real. The Russians made it clear, if you keep ramming us, we will start shooting. The U.S. Navy began to exercise informal restraint. Tactics became more cautious. The most provocative aspects of hull rubbing were scaled back. The Baton Rouge became a martyr for a safer ocean. Her sacrifice forced the 2 superpowers to acknowledge that the Cold War was truly over, preventing a future accident from turning into a nuclear exchange. The USS Baton Rouge dies a quiet death in a shipyard in Washington state, sliced apart by the very industrial efficiency that created her. Her reactor is buried in the high desert. Her steel is recycled. By 1994, she is gone, erased from the fleet roster as if she never existed. But the K-276 Kostroma refuses to disappear. In the years that follow the collision, the Russian submarine becomes a ghost of the Cold War, a lingering reminder of a conflict that the world is trying desperately to forget. She remains in service with the Northern Fleet, prowling the same gray waters where she earned her kill mark. For the next 30 years, she outlives everything. She outlives the Baton Rouge. She outlives the Yeltsin presidency. She outlives the chaotic poverty of the 1990s and the resurgence of Russian power in the 2000s. While her sister ships are rusted out and scrapped, the Kostroma keeps sailing. The red star on her tower fades in the salt spray, is repainted, fades, and is repainted again. It remains the only time in modern naval history that a submarine has openly displayed a victory mark for destroying another nuclear-powered vessel during peacetime. But as the decades pass, the Kostroma eventually succumbs to the same enemy that killed the Soviet Union: time and money. Despite periodic rumors in the Russian press about modernization refits and new Kaliber missile systems, the reality is more mundane. Titanium does not rust, but the machinery inside it does. The wires corrode, the rubber seals rot. As of 2025, the Kostroma is effectively a relic. She is likely laid up at a pier in the Kola Peninsula, inactive, waiting for a budget that may never come. She is a silent monument to a fallen empire, a titanium shell holding the memories of a time when the world stood on the razor's edge. The legacy of the Kildin Island collision, however, is not found in the metal of the ships. It is found in the silence that followed. The crash on February 11, 1992, was the final battle of the Cold War. It was the moment when the inertia of 40 years of hostility finally slammed into the reality of a new world. It was a physical contest between two philosophies: American steel, efficient, fast, disposable; Soviet titanium, expensive, tough, rare. The collision demonstrated that Soviet engineering, for all its economic flaws, produced some of the toughest machines on Earth. The Kostroma took the best shot the U.S. Navy could give it, a 6,000-ton body check, and shrugged it off. But it also demonstrated why the Soviet Union lost. They built machines they couldn't afford to maintain, while the Americans built machines they could afford to lose. The Baton Rouge was sacrificed, but the fleet she belonged to remained the master of the oceans. Ultimately, the collision served as a necessary shock. It was a wake-up call for the admirals and the politicians. It proved that peace is not just a declaration. It is a habit that must be learned. It showed that even when the treaties are signed and the walls are torn down, the danger remains as long as the old warriors are still patrolling the dark. The Baton Rouge and the Kostroma met in the dark so that the nations above them could finally see the light. History is often written as a series of dates. Wars start on this day, treaties are signed on that day. We like to believe that peace is a switch that is flipped, turning enemies into friends overnight. But the story of the Baton Rouge and the Kostroma reminds us that history has momentum. It is heavy. It takes time to slow down. The men inside those submarines were not villains. They were professionals doing the job their nations asked of them. They were patriots serving in a twilight era, caught between the certainty of the past and the confusion of the future. They relied on their machines to keep them safe, and when the machines collided, they relied on their training to keep them alive. We often look at the end of the Cold War as a victory of economics or ideology, but in the freezing waters of the Barents Sea, we see a different kind of truth. We see that the line between peace and war is thinner than a sheet of steel. It is held together not just by diplomats, but by the restraint of captains in the dark, and sometimes by the sheer luck that a collision results in a dent instead of a detonation. The ocean has healed the scar in the water where the two ships met. The waves have washed away the noise of the impact. But the lesson remains. We build our fortresses of steel and titanium. We draw our lines on the map. But in the end, we are all just navigating through the dark, hoping to avoid the obstacles we cannot see. Thank you for spending part of your day with us. If this journey into the hidden history of the Cold War meant something to you, we'd be honored to have you with us again. Until next time, stay curious and take good care.